Thank you for being here today. I want to say a couple of things before I actually get into the formal thing, as formal as anything I ever do is. There are two books that I would recommend to you that are spectacular resources about Rodgers and Hammerstein. And I started reading them in preparation for this and thought I knew a whole lot about Rodgers and Hammerstein, and I found out that I knew precious little. And now I'm really interested in finding out about Rodgers and Hammerstein more and more. But the first one is an older one from 2002 called The Sound of Their Music by Frederick Nolan. And the second was published last spring. And it had sat on a stack of books next to my bed that I was going to read eventually. Like all those stacked books I have. But I took it, I remembered that I had this book when I started talking about that, so I took it out, put it to the top of the stack, and couldn't put it down. And it's by Ken Pardon, who is a political writer for The Nation, and also the husband of Dee Dee Myers, who was connected to the Clintons, both the President Clinton and Hillary Clinton. And she recommended that he write this book because these were the songs of her childhood. And he remembered, well, these are the songs of my childhood also. And so he's written this absolutely magnificent, I can't describe to you how amazing the depth of what he's written is. So go get it. It would be a great Christmas present for you. It's a terrific read. And the good stories that I tell today about them came from his book. And it's called Something Wonderful.
Something.
Rodgers and Hammerstein began one of the most successful musical partnerships of the 20th century with Oklahoma. After Oklahoma, they produced Carousel, South Pacific, and The King and I, and were, as a result of that, some of the most important contributors to the change of the form of musical theater. And also, they inspired a whole bunch of new young composers to work in musical theater and to expand the form itself. And I want to try to share some of that with you today. The partnership also went on after those to produce shows such as Pellegrino, Me and Juliet, Pipe Dream, Flower Drum Song, and of course, Sound of Music. As well as a musical version of State Fair, which was itself a musicalization of a previous film, and a wonderful television show, musical Cinderella, that starred Julie Andrews. And Hammerstein wrote the book and the lyrics for Carmen Jones, which is an adaptation of Georges Bizet's opera, Carmen. Incidentally, a new production of Carousel played on Broadway this year, and also a reimagined version of Carmen Jones played off-Broadway this past year, and both were wonderfully successful. Among the many accolades their shows and film versions garnered were 34 Tony Awards, 15 Academy Awards, the Pulitzer Prize, and 2 Grammy Awards.
Wow.
As collaborators, they were a conundrum. They were both born in this little swath of upper middle class Harlem. They went to Columbia University, where they were members of Pi Lambda Phi fraternity, largely Jewish fraternity, and where they both fell under the spell of the college musical theater troupe called the Varsity Group, or the Varsity Show. Both of them were unhappy, perhaps miserable is the better word, in working in Hollywood. They loathed working in Hollywood, but both of them did it, both singly and together. They both married women named Dorothy, who were interior designers. But these women couldn't have been more different in their styles or their tastes. Both of them were shrewd businessmen, although each declared that they had nothing to do with the day-to-day running of the business. However, Dick, referring to Rodgers, loved money more than anybody I've ever seen, except Oscar Hammerstein, the costume designer Lucinda Ballard said. But I think it was different with Oscar. I think part of Oscar's nature was that he couldn't bear for people to spend money. And he was also stingy, really stingy. And yet Oscar was the most lovable man I've almost ever knew. And Dick really wasn't. In a 1973 interview with Newsweek, Stephen Sondheim described Hammerstein as a man of unlimited soul and limited talent, and Rodgers as a man of infinite talent but limited soul. Oscar Hammerstein was born on July 12, 1895, the son of Alice Hammerstein and the theatrical manager William Hammerstein. His grandfather was a German theater impresario, Oscar Hammerstein I. His father was from a Jewish family, and his mother was Scottish and English, and he was raised an Episcopalian. After his father's death, he participated in his first play at Columbia. His father had completely told him not to do theater. So he was studying law. He eventually quit law school to pursue theater, and Hammerstein began his first professional association with a man whose name is Otto Harbach. That began a 20-year association with Harbach, and this collaboration produced his first musical, Always You, for which he wrote the words and the book, and that show opened in 1920. Throughout the next 40 years, Hammerstein teamed up with innumerable people to write musicals. One of them was Jerome Kern, with whom he wrote Showboat, which is still considered one of America's great musical comedies and was also revived very recently and continues to be revived. One contemporary description of the show said, "Here we come to a completely new genre, the musical play as distinguished from the musical comedy. Now, the play was the thing, and everything else was subservient to that play. This represented the complete integration of song, humor, and production numbers into a single and inextricable artistic entity." Many years later, Hammerstein's wife, Dorothy, bristled when she heard a remark that Jerome Kern had written Old Man River. "Indeed not," she said. "Jerome Kern wrote Dum, 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 Dum. My husband wrote Old Man River." Other Kern-Hammerstein musicals included Sweet Adeline, Music in the Air, Three Sisters, and Very Warm for May, that also was recently revived. Hammerstein also collaborated with Vincent Yeomans, Rudolf Frimmel for something called Rosemarie, and Sigmund Romberg with two of the really great early musical theater pieces, Desert Song and The New Moon. Born July the 12th, 1902, notice their age difference. Richard Rodgers was born into a prosperous German Jewish family and began to play the piano at age 6. He spent almost all of his summers at a camp wigwam in Maine, where he wrote his first songs. Rodgers was influenced by Victor Herbert and Jerome Kern, both of whom Hammerstein had composed with, and the operettas that his parents took him to see when he was a child. In 1919, Richard Rodgers met Lawrence Hart. Rodgers and Hart had a very long relationship. They had years of Broadway success and spent some years in Hollywood. In 1935, after some success in Hollywood, they returned to Broadway and wrote an unbroken string of hit shows. Jumbo in 1935, On Your Toes 1936, which included the ballet Slaughter on 10th Avenue, choreographed by the young George Balanchine. And that piece is still extracted from the show and performed by ballet companies. The Boys from Syracuse, 1938. Pal Joey, 1940, which is still one of the anomalies of the American musical theater because it truly is neither fish nor fowl. And it has great tunes and a story that's based on John O'Hara. So if you know John O'Hara, you imagine what the story is, and it's very hard to produce now because it's not a musical drama in the sense that we have it now, but it's also not, certainly not a 1940 musical comedy. Rodgers also contributed to the books of a number of these shows. They had been close friends and partners for more than 2 decades, but in 1942, Larry Hart was increasingly falling prey to the problem that had plagued him all his life, severe alcoholism. And he really was pretty much dysfunctional at this point. He didn't want to work, and he told Richard Rodgers that he wasn't interested in adapting a play called Green Grow the Lilacs, which became Oklahoma. He said he wanted to go off to Mexico, and Rodgers said to him, well, if you go off to Mexico, all you want to do is drink. And Hart basically agreed and went. And when Hart got back, they had to basically sort of pour him onto the stretcher and took him to a hospital. Rodgers offered to go to a sanitarium with Hart if he would stop drinking, and Hart refused. So Rodgers approached Oscar Hammerstein, who had a farm in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which was not too far out of the city. And Rodgers went out to see Hammerstein on the farm and asked him to work with him. Hammerstein replied, well, as long as Larry can do the work, you have to stay with him because it would kill him if you left him. And if he can't do the work, then I'll be there. And that's how Rodgers and Hammerstein happened. Hart didn't actually die until after Oklahoma opened, but he was unable and unwilling to do the work. Because Rodgers and Hammerstein are such a famous pair now, we must think that, oh, well, it was like that, immediate, and everybody thought it was great. Well, that's not exactly what happened. In the time before Oklahoma opened, there was real skepticism from people about whether the two of them would work together well or could work together well because of the years they had spent working closely with other people. Particularly, could Rodgers work with someone who worked as differently as Hart did? Hammerstein's habits were extremely regular. That's the big thing about Hammerstein. Hammerstein was completely regimented and regular and kept exact notes of everything that went on and what he did. He was just as predictable as Larry Hart had been unpredictable. But he and Dickson usually work in the same room. Hammerstein most often worked at his farmhouse in Pennsylvania or one of his mansions in Manhattan. Rodgers would work at his New York apartment or in his Connecticut country home. And Hammerstein would dictate or mail or messenger lyrics to him. In a draft of the script, Hammerstein described the prelude to the ballet. The description is followed by the terse typewritten note, "Take it, Agnes." And indeed, she did. In 12 or 13 minutes, the ballet elaborates on the characters in ways that would take pages of exposition and dialogue. Years later, Hammerstein wrote in a dance magazine essay, "Here, indeed, the choreographer became the collaborator of the author and the composer. Not lately, not merely for the enhancement of one or two moments in the play, but in helping to deliver the very bone and muscle of the story. Oklahoma was received in 1943 the way Hamilton is received today, as something really radically new in the theater. Green Grow the Lilacs, the play that Oklahoma was adapted from, was written in France by a 29-year-old gay cowboy turned poet and playwright who was from Oklahoma. He was trying in that play to capture his nostalgic feelings about growing up in Oklahoma before it was a state. Here's what Lynn Riggs wrote in the stage directions to the prologue of the play. It is a radiant summer morning several years ago, the kind of morning which, enveloping the shapes of earth, men, cattle in a meadow, blades of young corn, streams, makes them seem to exist now for the first time. Their images giving off a visible golden emanation, which is partly true and partly a trick of the imagination, focusing to keep alive a loveliness that may pass away. Hammerstein admired this prose greatly, took that kind of wonderful passage, and in a painstaking effort that took 3 weeks to complete, turned it into the first poetry that he gave Rodgers for that lone cowboy.
There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. The corn is as high as an elephant's eye, and it looks like it's climbing straight up to the sky. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I've got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way. Oh, the cattle are standing like statues. Oh, the cattle are standing like statues. They don't turn their heads as they see me ride by. There's a little brown maverick that's winking her eye. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I've got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way. All the sounds of the earth are like music. All the sounds of the earth are like music. The breeze is so busy it don't miss a tree. And an old weeping willow is laughing at me. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I've got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way. Oh, what a beautiful day.
Thank you. Oklahoma was a sensation. The show won an honorary Pulitzer Prize and ran for 5 years and 9 weeks, 2,212 performances. It was the first show to have an original cast recording. Decca Records decided to record the cast with the original orchestrations and put it out. It was such a success, those 78s in their brown paper sleeves, that it became the norm for a successful Broadway show on the Sunday after opening to record an album. These were, after all, the popular songs of their time. These theater songs were the tunes people heard on the radio and in dance bands and played from sheet music all over America. At the same time, Oscar began collaborating with his new partner. Another newcomer, a 12-year-old boy, entered the Hammerstein family's life, destined to become Oscar's lifelong friend, surrogate son, and favorite pupil, and his greatest legacy to the American musical theater beyond his own work. The boy's name was Stephen Joshua Sondheim. The comic musical Sondheim wrote at George School, aptly called By George, was a success among his peers and buoyed the young songwriter's self-esteem. When Sondheim asked Hammerstein to evaluate it as though he had no knowledge of its author, he said it was the worst thing that he had ever seen. But if you want to know why it's terrible, I'll tell you. They spent the rest of the day going over the musical, and Sondheim later said, "In that afternoon, I learned more about songwriting and the musical theater than most people learn in a lifetime." With Oklahoma still selling out, Rodgers Hammerstein accepted an offer to make a rewrite of State Fair, a 1933 film, but only if they did not have to take up residence in Hollywood, which they both loved. So A Story About Iowa was filmed in Southern California and written in Connecticut and Pennsylvania. The most famous song, and one of the most widely performed by Rodgers and Hammerstein, is It Might As Well Be Spring. Since it's the only Rodgers and Hammerstein tune to win an Academy Award, I think the story of its genesis bears telling. It seems that Hammerstein was stuck with lyrics for a song for Maggie, whose voice very often, as was in that time, dubbed by somebody else, who has a case of the blues. Oscar telephoned his partner and said she feels as if she has spring fever, but everyone knows that state fairs take place in fall. How would it be if he wrote that she knows that it's autumn, but given the way she feels, it might as well be spring? Oscar, Rodgers said, that's it.
I'm as restless as a willow in a windstorm. I'm as jumpy as a puppet on a string. I'd say that I had spring fever, but I know it isn't spring. I'm as starry-eyed and vaguely discontented, like a nightingale without a song to sing. Oh, why should I have spring fever when it isn't even spring? I keep wishing I were somewhere else, walking down a strange new street, hearing words that I have never heard from a man I've yet to meet. I'm as busy as a spider spinning daydreams. I'm as giddy as a baby on a swing. I haven't seen a crocus or a rosebud or a robin on a wing, but I feel so gay in a melancholy way that it might as well be spring.
November of 1943, it was time to move forward. And the 1909 play Lilium by Hungarian playwright Ferenc Molnár was chosen. The play had been recently revived on Broadway in an uncredited translation by the multilingual Larry Hart. And Molnár was living in New York, having immigrated to America to avoid the persecution of Hungarian Jews. Molnár had previously refused to allow a musical version of the play, even turning down Puccini. He wanted it to be his play, not someone else's opera. If I loved you, this is how I would behave. And if I loved you, this is what I would feel and how I would think and what I would do. They are falling in love in front of us because of the brilliance of the way the dialogue weaves in and out of the music and the underscoring of the dialogue in a way that might be more common in a movie. There's this heightened emotional nature to what is going on. It is naturalistic, but it is almost operatic in its emotional impact and in the power of its, the way this is all blending. It is so intimate that we almost feel as if we are eavesdropping. Hammerstein considered the scene almost too wonderful and beautiful to tamper with, and he didn't. He just took Molnár's words. Stephen Sondheim called this scene probably the singular most important moment in the development of contemporary musicals.
If I loved you, time and again I would try to say all I'd want you to know. If I loved you, words wouldn't come in an easy way. Round in circles I'd go, longing to tell you, but afraid and shy. I'd let my golden chances pass me by. Soon you'd leave me. Off you would go in the mist of day, never, never to know how I love you. If I loved you.
Well, anyway, you don't love me. That's what you said.
Yes.
You're a funny kid. I don't remember ever meeting a girl like you. Are you trying to get me to marry you?
No.
What's putting it into my head? You're different, all right. I don't know what it is. You look up at me with that little kid face like you trust me. I wonder what it would be like.
What?
Nothing. I know what it would be like. It'd be awful. I could just see myself, kinda scrawny and pale, picking at my food, and lovesick like any other guy. I'd throw away my sweater and dress up like a dude in a dickie and a collar and a tie. If I loved you.
But you don't.
No, I don't. But somehow I can see just exactly how I'd be if I loved you. Time and again I would try to say all you wanted to know. would come in an easy way. Round in circles I'd go, longing to tell you, but afraid and shy. I'd let my golden chances pass me by. Soon you'd leave me, off you would go in the mist of day, never, never to know how I loved you, if I loved you. I'm not a feller to marry anybody. Even if a girl was foolish enough to want me to, I wouldn't.
Don't worry about it, Billy.
Who's worried?
The reviews were rapturous. One critic wrote, "The pair who can do no wrong continue to do no wrong." To the end of Rodgers' life, Carousel would remain his favorite show, his favorite score. Hammerstein had had it in his mind to write the story of one man's life from birth to death. It was no surprise that he chose for his protagonist a doctor. Hammerstein's closest friend from childhood was his own doctor, whom he consulted often. Rodgers was interested in the story because both his brother and his father were distinguished New York physicians. Allegro was probably the only show in the history of musicals where the creators set out to be non-commercial. There was the plan to make this minimalist musical, having its inspiration from Thornton Wilder's Our Town. A Greek chorus would be used to frequently interrupt the mental and emotional reactions of the principal characters. There were no walls, no sets of any kind, except just some rolling platforms that had little pieces on them. And Agnes DeMille was chosen to direct and choreograph this musical. Watching all these proceedings was the 17-year-old Stephen Sondheim, who'd been hired by Hammerstein for $250 a week to be a gopher. Sondheim remembers, "It was a seminal influence on my life because it showed me a lot of smart people doing something wrong." This experience also informs his creative life. "That's why I am drawn to experiment," he has said. "I realize that I'm trying to recreate Allegro all the time." After the disappointment of Allegro, everyone was looking for another hit. James Michener, author of Tales of the South Pacific, said, "These fellows were so mad that they could have made a great musical out of some 3 pages of the Bronx phone directory." The New York Times had pronounced Michener's book a collection of loosely linked tales of interactions of Americans with the South Sea Island inhabitants, truly one of the most remarkable books to come out of the war. For Hammerstein, part of the appeal of Michener's book was its frank treatment of racial prejudice. Mary Martin auditioned with Indian Love Call and told Hammerstein, "You probably don't know it." After her audition, he replied simply, "Young lady, you have something. I'd like to give you some advice, and we could work together on it, and I wrote it." Ezio Pinza, the Metropolitan Opera basso, auditioned because he was at the end of his operatic career and was cast. They were a formidable team as Nellie Forbush from Arkansas and Emile Debec, the Frenchman on the South Sea Island. The show was praised a magnificent musical drama in the Times and as a show of rare enchantment. It was also the night that Mary Rodgers introduced a young friend of hers, Harold Prince, to Stephen Sondheim. And within a few years, they were making musical theater history. The score features beautiful love songs like Some Enchanted Evening and Younger Than Springtime. The song Carefully Taught that came in for a great deal of criticism, frankly, for being overly didactic, and a bunch of delightful comic and up-tempo numbers. One of those is Cockeyed Optimist. And apparently Cockeyed was one of, I was struck again last night by, Cockeyed was one of Hammerstein's favorite words apparently because it crops up at least a couple of times in The Sound of Music. So, a cockeyed optimist.
Gosh, it's beautiful here. Would you look at that yellow sun? You know, I don't think it's the end of the world like everybody else thinks. I just can't work myself up to getting that low. When the sky is a bright canary yellow, I forget every cloud I've ever seen. So they call me a cockeyed optimist, immature and incurably green. I have heard people rant and rave and bellow that we're done and we might as well be dead. But I'm only a cockeyed optimist, and I can't get it into my head. I hear the human race is falling on its face and hasn't very far to go. But every whippoorwill is selling me a bill and telling me it just ain't so. I could say life is just a bowl of Jell-O and appear more intelligent and smart. But I'm stuck like a dope with a thing called hope, and I can't get it out of my heart. Not this heart.
And that probably sums up Oscar Hammerstein totally, that cockeyed optimist. The next show was The King and I. The King and I was based on a book that both of the Dorothys had read when it first came out and loved. And so they had each singly been telling their spouse, this would make a great musical. And there were odd things about it, though. There's no conventional love interest between the two main characters. They never kiss. There are no American characters in the show. Everybody is British or Asian. The setting is Bangkok, which to most Americans at that time was, where is that? And the period is Victorian, with probably the most gorgeous costume I've ever seen on a stage in the Lincoln Center production. That Shall We Dance dress of Kelly O'Hara's is like a mile wide and a story high, and it's just gorgeous Victorian dress. There's precious little humor. Hammerstein didn't want any dancing girls with Oriental costumes who sang ching-a-ling-a-ling with cymbals on their fingers. Instead, he aimed the libretto toward the pageantry and the dignity of the East. Rodgers was crazy about the book. That was high praise from a man who usually pronounced something he really, really liked as very adequate. When the show opened on March 29th in the same theater, and almost 8 years to the day that Oklahoma burst on the scene, the critics hailed another triumph by the miracle men of Broadway. Yul Brynner became an instant star and owned this part until 1985, and was the perfect foil for the fey charm of Gertrude Lawrence. And Noah Coward was asked to direct the original production because of his closeness with Gertrude Lawrence, and he said, this is not what I need to do. So, this score that Rodgers created is of two separate styles. One is the style of the Orient with open fifths and fourths that are our sort of quintessential idea of what Oriental music is, and Western music styles for Anna and her son. The score was called Exuberant, Radiant, and Glorious. One of the most soaring, if politically incorrect to us today, pieces in that score is Lady Tiang's Something Wonderful, in which she begs the angry Mrs. Anna to help defend the king against foreign accusations that he is a barbarian.
This is a man who thinks with his heart. His heart is not always wise. This is a man who stumbles and falls, but this is a man who tries. This is a man you'll forgive and help and protect as long as you live. He will not always say what you would have him say, but now and then he'll say something wonderful. The thoughtless things he'll do will hurt and worry you. Then all at once he'll do something wonderful. He has 1,000 dreams that won't come true. You know that he believes in them, and that's enough for you. You'll always go along, defend him when he's wrong, and tell him when he's strong. He is wonderful. He'll always need your love, and so he'll get your love. A man who needs your love can be wonderful.
Cole Porter once said that Rodgers and Hammerstein made musical theater harder for everyone else in the business. The truth is they made it harder for themselves also. A number of shows followed, Me and Juliet, A Backstage Romance, Pipe Dreams, a fascinating flop that's a personal favorite of mine because of its daring book and its wonderful music, based on 2 Steinbeck novellas. Imagine that. Flower Drum Song, a story of the clash between traditional Chinese values and assimilation at a Chinese community of San Francisco, in movie adaptations of their major works. There was even a delightful television musical that I told you about earlier, Cinderella, that finally made it to Broadway in 2013 in an absolutely glorious production. In 1959, they created The Sound of Music. Mary Martin, 43 years old, but seeming and sounding much younger, became the driving force of the show. She also invested $200,000 for a 25% share, which gave her and her husband the kind of influence that Rodgers and Hammerstein preferred not to give to actors. The collaboration proved tense. Work began on a show tentatively called Love Song, a title that didn't really suit anyone and was so common that it was said copyright would be difficult to secure or defend. Hammerstein kept detailed worksheets of his draft lyrics. For the opening number in which Maria is discovered reclining in a tree, there's this early effort to laugh like a brook when it trips on a stone, to hum like the leaves on the vines, to pray in the dark like a nightingale. Only after Rodgers wrote the accompanying tune, which required some word changes, did Hammerstein settle on the final version, the one we all know today, to laugh like a brook when it trips and falls over stones on its way, to sing through the night like a lark who is learning to pray. I go to the hills when my heart is lonely. I know I will hear what I've heard before. My heart will be blessed with the sound of music, and I'll sing once more. On April 4th, Oscar had finished the lyric and said he'd also decided that The Sound of Music must be the title of the show itself. In October of that year, in a room at the Ritz-Carlton, Boston, Rodgers and Hammerstein worked out the final version of a new song for the captain, Edelweiss, with that touching last line, "Bless my homeland forever." And the song went immediately into the show. It was perfect. And Theodore Burkell, who was playing the captain, would say that a fan once stopped him at the stage door to say, "I love that Edelweiss," adding, "Of course, I've known it for a long time, but only in the German." It was the last lyric that Oscar wrote, his 1,589th. By the time of the New York opening on November 16, 1959, the advance ticket sales topped $2.3 million. Despite the critics carping, and there was a lot of it, the show was a hit. Mary Martin won the Tony Award for Best Actress, beating out Ethel Merman as Gypsy's mother, who said simply, "How you gonna buck a nun?" It was then made into their most successful movie, a winner of the Academy Award for Best Picture, and its soundtrack album stayed at #1 on the Billboard charts for 14 weeks, longer than any album by Elvis Presley or the Beatles. And with Julie Andrews in the lead, this is arguably their most well-known artistic product. Sondheim remembered that shortly before Hammerstein's death, Hammerstein had given him a portrait of himself. Sondheim asked him to inscribe it and said later about the request that it was weird. It's like asking your father to inscribe something. Reading the inscription, "For Stevie, my friend and teacher," the composer choked up and said, "That describes Oscar better than anything I could say." When he walked away from the house that evening, Sondheim remembered a sad, sinking feeling that he had said his final goodbye. He never saw his mentor again. 3 days later, Hammerstein died of stomach cancer on September 30th, 1960. Sondheim wrote, his lyrics were sui generis. They were more than heartfelt and passionate. They were monumental. In the end, it's not the sentimentality, but the monumentality that matters. Rodgers continued to work on shows through the opening of I Remember Mama on May 31st, 1979. It was Rodgers' 40th original Broadway show and his last. Rodgers died December 30th, 1979. After he was mentored by Oscar Hammerstein II, Sondheim has continued to return the favor, saying that he loves passing on what Oscar passed on to me. In an interview with Sondheim for the Legacy Project, composer-lyricist Adam Gettle, son of Mary Rodgers and grandson of Richard Rodgers, recalls how as a 14-year-old boy, he showed Sondheim his work. Gettle was crestfallen, since he had come in sort of all puffed up, thinking he would be rained with compliments and things, which was not the case, since Sondheim had some very direct things to say to him. Later, Sondheim wrote and apologized to Gettle for being not very encouraging when he was actually trying to be constructive. Later, Sondheim would pronounce Gettle's music dazzling. Richard Rodgers, who died when Gettle was 15, overheard an early composition, said he liked it, and asked him to play it louder. Gettle has qualified the compliment, noting that Rodgers was literally on his deathbed on the other side of the living room wall. Still, the DNA of Rodgers has a place in the contemporary Broadway theater. In 2005, Adam Gettle won the Tony Award for Best Original Score for the original production of Light in the Piazza, the tender story of a mentally disabled girl who falls in love in Florence, the same property that the dying Oscar Hammerstein had found such a tempter 45 years before. Thank you.